on here was sound. I guess we'll test the sound live, and how that works with Zoom is even more of an issue. Uh, People on Zoom, bear with me. I'm just going to see where this sound comes out. Of my laptop. Yeah. Sound comes out of my laptop, as does my own voice from the Zoom call. So how can I deal with this? I need to mute my Zoom-ness and get the sound to go into Zoom as well as your speakers. Maybe I just skip this bit. Unless you can think of a logical solution. I think I probably need to also tell the laptop to send it here.
Yeah.
I think I'm just going to skip it. It's fine. What I was going to show you, and we can maybe play without the sound, explains the title. So Permission to Muck About is the title of a documentary film that I and my colleague Dave Green made over the course of about 2.5 years. And the video is the prologue to that film. So it's a feature-length documentary film. It's a couple of hours long, and it's about design research. So my whole fellowship is about design research. The single tagline is showing the world the value of design research. And the little bits you see here, this is a poem that David Blanton, who's a street poet, wrote to me and Dave when we told him about this project. We were in New Orleans for Kai. This guy on the street said, "What are you guys doing here?" We explained it to him, and he wrote this poem inspired by what we told him about design research. And it's really quite beautiful, but you'll have to go and watch the film to hear it. The reason we made a documentary film, here's some of the words of the film, the poem. So meaning is found in the process. Poetry is a controlled hallucination that's been exhumed, not examined under a microscope. Understanding the world requires metaphors. And how do we understand anything at all? Our brains create models of the world, and words create a grammar of intuition. Our thoughts become a theater of the mind. And David's taking his world, which is poetry, and trying to apply it to what we'd explained about design research. So design, like poetry, means nothing without the journey. And designs are extension of humanity's fingerprints. We make the world around us. This and that must separate. By the way, I'll explain why there's crabs here in a moment. We must separate chance from fate. Every design takes us somewhere, and in everywhere, there's some of you and me and poetry. And what you're going to miss here is the kind of crazy guitar chord you get in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. And it says, "Permission to muck about." So that's the little introduction to the film. That QR code will take you to the part of my website that's got the film on there. It's broken down into snackable little chunks. So there's 2 hours altogether, but you can watch it in 5, 6, 7-minute little chunks. And if you like it, you can continue watching. I was saying the reason we made a film is the original plan for this whole project was to do a series of ethnographic studies with organizations trying to explain to them what design research was, and then experimentally see if it helped them to do what those organizations do. That was the plan, but then it was 2020 and there was a pandemic. There was no way that we could do that kind of field work. But what we wanted to get out of all that field work was a compelling story about what design research is and how it works, and what you can achieve with it. And something that we thought we'd be able to do was make a documentary film and get the same message at the end of it. So that's why we ended up doing it that way. This slide represents the fact I've done a bunch of other stuff. I find myself here from not finishing school, finding myself writing code, doing an art degree at university, managing a department in the National Health Service. This was me doing that. And then after a very bad day at work, I saw an advertisement for a PhD program, and that was how I ended up doing my PhD. And so this poster never made it up onto the walls of the hospital. I had to throw it away. But it turns out that actually that sort of unconventional route, I think, has been a really useful thing to help me look at the world the way I do and to appreciate what design research does, which is generally bring a multidisciplinary view to lots of problems. And in my case, often HCI and technology problems. This again is just a bit of my background. My PhD title was a thesis about design fiction. It was about design fiction, which is a speculative design research methodology. And at the time, I really loved the idea of design fiction and I wanted to use it, but it wasn't really a thing that people were using as a serious research approach. So I decided to make my PhD about trying to develop that practice and bring it into a way where other people could use it. And I think since then it's become much more mainstream. I did some postdoctoral research, which also used design fiction, and ultimately has led me to where I am now, which is talking about design research more generally, but design fiction is just a type of design research. I'm going to skip over super quickly in the interest of time, but the super short version is design fiction is diegetic prototyping, and a diegetic prototype, diegetic just means inside the world of a story. So this story is the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. This is a diegetic prototype, so a prototype inside there, and it's a prototype of how you go to the toilet in zero gravity. These sorts of prototypes are really common in Hollywood movies, and that's where the inspiration comes from. The point of them is it makes you think through the detail of what would the world be like if I had to go to the toilet in zero gravity. You force yourself to prototype that world. I did this in various different ways through the PhD. This one was the world where people use drones to give out parking tickets and find people who let their dogs poo on the streets. What does that world look like? Well, it's got these landing stations, signage. We rewrote the law, a control system. This is a similar one with emotionally aware computing. So what if your smartphone could tell you if the person you were on a date with was actually telling the truth? What would that world look like? And we told that through some product design, Kickstarter campaign, and some comics. This one was about data protection, GDPR, Internet of Things devices, and what would a world look like if things were designed with you in mind and giving you as much information as possible about where your data goes. And the big takeaway from the PhD in all of this is design fiction, you can think of it as building a world. And to be honest, most research is building a world in a way. You think, what would it be like if the thing I'm researching was true or if it worked? You have to do that bit of world building to imagine how your research might change things. That's the same as what's going on with design fiction, but it's specifically about trying to understand that world and understand, is the technology you're interested in or the policy change or the societal shift, is that something that seems preferable or nice? Aside from the PhD thesis, all of those ideas are in this little book, which is about 30 or 40 pages long. So that's a much more accessible way into all the examples, if that's interesting. Now, the point of this part of the story is, and I'm not going to labor this too much, again, in the interest of time, these are classic examples of how you articulate speculative design. And after 6 or 7 years of showing these to people and really believing in them, I started to think this is not necessarily the truth. There's something wrong here. And the thing that was wrong is I realized it was just explaining a load of other stuff as well. It's not exclusive to design fiction. This seems to apply to almost all design research, almost all HCI research, in fact, involves this. I'm at this moment in the present and I'm doing something that's out in the future. It might change. And I'm trying to understand what's the preferable path to take. That's what my research is about. So I started to think there's something not that special about design fiction. These diagrams, if I was going to speak for longer, would come to the same conclusion. They were made to explain this specialist area, but I thought they're completely applicable to a much broader area. And at the same time, I'd been doing a postdoctoral contract for 4 years and was sick of constantly having to get more funding to make sure I had a job. And I wanted to change something. There was necessity is the mother invention. Something needed to change. And what I did was broaden my horizons out from the design fiction niche I was in. And really what I became interested in was how practice, so how doing things, designing things, creates knowledge in the world. So not just speculative design, but design in general, and in fact, just practice in general. Whether I'm cooking or whether I'm learning a physical skill, how does that make knowledge in the world? And I pitched all of this in the fellowship proposal. This is essentially the pitch. I want to introduce the amazing, discipline-transcending, future-revealing power of design research. We need it because the world's complex and fast and globalized, and we need to make sense of it more than ever before. And design research has grown. It's used all over the place, but the methods are still kind of young, and we need to persuade people that it's a good thing to do. And we're going to do this through a big longitudinal ethnographic study, which never happened. And that pitch basically worked with UKRI, and they funded the project. It became Design Research Works. And Design Research Works is not just a project, it's the people behind it. It's lots of sub-projects, and it's papers, but it's also a bunch of things that aren't papers. There's prototypes. There's actually a paper we wrote called This Is Not a Paper that I'll share with you in a moment. Altogether, it's a program of stuff, and it's a program that comes together under this, this objective of trying to show the world the value of this way of doing research practice. So that's the end of my PowerPoint deck. The rest of this presentation is a web browser. So this is the project website. You can see there. Our mission is to show the world what it can gain from design research. I'm not going to do that maximize thing because I want to see what tabs are coming up next. And what I'm going to do is just give a quick overview of the range of things that some of the things that we've done over the last 5 years that I thought might have a general interest to people doing HCI research, or just might be a bit novel, something you may have not seen before. What we'll end up at is getting a bit deeper into a whole line of work that I've done around working with Gen AI, so generative artificial intelligence, in particular this real-time image generator technology I've been playing with, and a user interface that we built for that. And a lot of these examples, they're interesting in their own right, but they all plug into this broader mission of trying to demonstrate the value of design research as well. And very broadly, the project split into two halves as well. We've got the research into design research, which is sort of this meta perspective, things like the documentary film go in there. And then we've got applied stuff, which is trying to take all of that thinking and apply it in a particular project or to a particular problem. So first, see if this thing loads up. This was, again, the start of the pandemic. We wanted to do something a bit quirky to submit to Kai. And what we wanted to make was a paper that wasn't a paper. Obviously, the real conference couldn't happen, so we came to the idea of making a paper inside GatherTown, which is this sort of interactive video conferencing system It's a bit like a video game. So you run around, and if you meet another character inside there, as soon as your character comes together, it pops up a video conferencing thing. So we thought we'd just put the text from our paper in the background and allow people to walk around the paper and chat to each other whilst reading it. And our presentation for this was great because it was an online conference, and we just said, okay, the presentation is go to this URL and let people play around. And it was lots of fun. The whole thing was modeled on an egg. So to go into the paper, you go into the eggshell. The egg box is, I think, maybe the authors list. I can't quite remember this. Yeah, these are the authors. We go back through the egg, then into the main egg. And what you end up is this Mondrian-inspired landscape of eggs. I think each of the eggs, yeah, maybe is that a legacy hand? So all of the sections of the paper are modeled off pandemic tropes of like, I think you're on mute. Is that a legacy hand? Can you see my screen? And each one does actually have some legitimate text inside it, which are all quite interesting, little mini one-page essays. And of course, you can follow the citations around. And there's loads of Easter eggs hidden inside this metaphorical egg. I can't remember my way around it. My favorite one was inside the pipe. So this is a reference to this famous abstract art piece. Maybe if we go in the mouthpiece and then you go up the smoke. Anyway, there was no great point to this. This was as the project was getting going, we were exploring the notion of different types of research output as well as just reacting to the pandemic. And it was a bit of a team building exercise as well. As we get deeper and deeper into this pixelated thing, the joke here is the artwork was called This Is Not a Pipe, and it's This Is Not a Paper. It's the joke there. So we did that. Around the same time with Dr. David Philip Green, who was the first postdoc working with me, we did a bunch of more traditional research, so talking to people, doing interviews, analyzing that data, and did a bunch of writing about the inherent ambiguity of design research. So many people call themselves a design researcher, but it means a whole bunch of different things. The HCI crowd were particularly interesting because people like Eva Luger, Stuart Reeves in Nottingham, even John Vines in Edinburgh. Often, these are like famous design research people, and you say, can you explain to me what design research is? And they would say, oh, I don't do like design. And it's a really interesting thing. So we researched some of that, published some papers about it. This was a thing we made called Cuba, which stood for Question Bridge. And it was inspired by a documentary film called Question Bridge that explored the experience of Black men living in America. And it started with one question. The guy asked one of his friends who answered the question, but posed another one. And that went to another person, and there was this chain that went on. And we thought we'd replicate the same sort of chain, but with this question: what is design research? It was another pandemic era thing where we couldn't get out and do real things with people, so we did this. It was super interesting, and this is kind of how the design looked. So you can always trace the questions back to the source question. So this is me here saying, what is design research? And then responses would get chained, and you get responses to the responses. And it worked quite nicely, but actually was also a bit of a failure, if I'm honest. We found it very difficult to persuade people to engage with this. And I think probably the video format was the problem. People got very nervous in front of the camera and then would say things in a way that they thought didn't look smart and therefore didn't want to be part of it. So although it was interesting and we ran it for a few months, it didn't get that far, but it did generate some data around these big questions about design research. I think just to read some of these out. So we start with what is design research. Let's go with Paul here, who says the answer to that is to understand design research, we first need to understand design. Design research is where art and science meet as equals in a research process. But then his question is, can design and design research exist outside of a capitalist model? So very quickly, we get into these kind of big political questions. Serena's answer to that is market logics are closely linked to design, but design research is outside of that already. It helps you think through alternatives. And she asks, is research through design doing more harm than good? And then Paul sent a reply back to this. God, it goes on and on and on. But you get the idea, and this was generating data for us, which was helping to frame the questions better. So that happened. Then we did this thing called a lab engagement program, and this was when the pandemic restrictions were being relaxed and we could actually go places again. The lab engagement program involved traveling around, show this little video, to, I think altogether we went to maybe 16 or 17 labs around the world, and each one were there for a few days and went through a series of activities. One of the key things we were doing was interviewing people for our documentary. We were also setting up a diary study, so people that were doing this kind of research, getting them to keep a diary, which they sent back to us later to be analyzed. And we were also exploring this idea of, in this workshop, you see, we did a workshop at each one of these places. We were exploring the idea of what would a repository or a database of examples of design research look like? Because there isn't one that really exists. If we're interested in just design research from the HCI world, the ACM Digital Library's got a lot of examples in, but it doesn't have all of them. There's other avenues to publish. And then there's all the other types of design research out there. And if you're a newcomer and you want to understand the broad spectrum of this sort of research activity, there's nothing there. And so we ran a series of workshops posing this question to people to try and understand, is it worth exploring this more, and what could an answer to that question look like? This was part of that process. This was an early provocation where we took a speculative design approach to the problem and came up with 3 different prototypes. So this one was a time travel based prototype. This one was a spectrum and gradient based interface where you could define a spectrum of the things you're interested in. And this was a super traditional one on the left there. And there were loads of really out there metaphors in here, the metaphor of a river delta, the metaphor of a murmuration of birds. And this was flatly rejected on multiple submissions to various places. And ultimately, we put some of the review comments on this to remind ourselves of what they said. So the abstract should be completely rewritten, said reviewer 1. Page 9 adds nothing to the paper, and so on. I am sympathetic to the use of florid language, but this paper abuses this resource. The writing is obscure. And these I'm not including to say they were wrong. And in fact, some of these reviewers have come and spoken to us to clarify what they were thinking. This was a super useful thought experiment and never saw the light of day as we made it. And by the way, what you see is 12 A4 pages where each page is an essay in its own right. You can read it without all the other ones, but you can stick them all together to make an A0 paper poster. And there's lots of little tricks to help you read it. So there's actually a map showing where each page goes, which is the little squares in the bottom left-hand corner. And there's also these lines that we draw, the colored lines, and they show where a concept, which is referred to on page 3, where it might be linked to in another part of the paper. And this is another sort of comment on the format of research, where could we do more to help people, help increase the readability of the research articles we produce. But the workshops as part of that tour, this is the data we gathered from all of those workshops. You can see we got lots and lots of sketches of different types of database, and we got lots of little bits of data about potential users and what their motivations would be. something that I found really interesting was themes began to emerge about different user interfaces people would suggest. And one that kept coming up that felt really random at first was soup, where these came from three completely different people on different days at different locations, but they all came up with the metaphor as a bowl of soup for what a database for examples of research should be, which I just found amusing. On here somewhere, we began to prototype what such a system could look like. So we put all of this thinking into actually designing a real thing, and that's recently launched as this Design Research Observatory. I think we currently have 21 projects on there, and one of the big where a lot of the work actually went with this was coming up with a format that was super accessible. So for each project, it says, what is this project? It's a literal explanation of what it is. Then who is it for? Like, why did you make this thing? And if it's for people that go to Kai, that's fine. If it's for policymakers, that's fine. If it's for someone who's designing, in this case, an AI environment for cats, that's fine. But just to explicitly say who it's for, what was your approach? So, there's lots and lots of different research approaches. You might have done a critical design with a thematic analysis and case studies and an ethnographic study. We get people to say very simply what they did, and then what have we learned? What's the contribution? And why is it in this collection? Because we're not trying to collect all of the examples out there. We're trying to make a collection that works well with the other things in it to give a rounded view. And with all of these keywords we have in there, so like research through design, or we could go with human-centered design, there's a little very short introduction. So this is totally different to things like the Interaction Design Encyclopedia, which gives you sort of massive essay length things, which are often derived from research articles. This is designed in such a way that you can learn about a particular project. So Abundance is a design fiction about the future of London and water level rises. You can learn about a project and read the whole thing in about 5 minutes. And if you need to learn what Foresight Studies is, you can click on Foresight Studies and get a rough overview of what that is pretty quickly. So that's what we made based on all those workshops. The stuff I'll talk about next, going to keep going super fast to try and get to the potentially the most fun things. This was a project called Shape of Trust. It was funded by the Trustworthy Autonomous Systems Hub. And what we were trying to understand is, in the context of autonomous vehicles, how do you define each individual's relationship with trust? Because we're all unique, we're all different. That sketch note captures a workshop that we ran as part of the process. Actually, I'm talking about entirely the wrong project. I got them in the wrong order. This is the Shape of Trust one. We had a similar sketch note that looked similar. And this was really good fun. So we ran a bunch of workshops and then we ultimately made this prototype. And the idea with this is a bit out there, but basically these shapes are all capturing individuals' responses to particular situations. So your autonomous vehicle might choose to take a different route, which isn't the one you specified, to be faster or something, or it won't let you out of the door for your own safety, these kind of situations. We capture responses to those situations and map them onto these geometric shapes and then layer those up. So there's lots of different circumstances and your levels of trust change depending on the circumstances. The point was we were trying to imagine that each person could have a unique fingerprint for your trust relationship. And what would the world be like? So the speculation was, what would the world be like if I could plug my trust relationship into an autonomous vehicle or into software or into anything and get a customized response, which is just for me. At the moment, what we have is a kind of big regulation like GDPR, which is just the law. It's the lowest level of how things should be. And we get a huge disclaimer that you have to say yes to use the service. This is exploring what a more personal thing could be like. This that I was showing you was actually a completely different project. This was about how do we understand digital space and how do we find our way around in it? One way of conceptualizing digital space is the Zoom meeting that we're on here. So it is spatialized. You see the faces in a grid. People refer to that. They say, well, you're next in the list, so I'll choose you. And you can deliberately put people in different spaces if you want. We wanted to understand that and understand how to make these things more accessible, and ultimately made a video game that uses only sound to help to navigate a maze. And the idea was just focus on sound because it's a very, it removes all of the complexity of the screen so we can think about the problem in a more simple way. And the game, just to make it an experimental space where we didn't have any restrictions or assumptions about particular types of application. What we ended up making was this thing called Extraordinary. The branding looks awful, but it's a playable game that's up there on Steam. And this was a really intrinsic part of Zach's PhD, had a huge amount of potential. And one of the spaces we wanted to take this into was, again, if you imagine video conferencing, where the user interface was separate from the architecture behind it. So what I mean by that is, if I prefer an interface like GatherTown or a video game, why can't I enter in that way and interact with you, and you might prefer Zoom. So you get to see things in the traditional sort of Zoom layout. I get a different experience. Why can't we set these things up in that way? And what kind of new collaborations could that create? So far, we've not been able to extend that project, but it was super interesting. Weirdly, that project about autonomous vehicles and trust ended up plugging into a whole arm of my research, which is about the more than human space. So this is the simplest way of putting it, if you don't know, is imagine human-centered design. It's very much you have the human, you put them at the center, that motivates your decisions. More than human design is like, well, let's have the human in the equation, but we're just aware of the whole world. You know, other species, the environment, what happens then? That trust project facilitated some thinking about that, which came up with this idea of productive oscillation. And if you ever find yourself in the more than human world, I find this really useful. And it's not getting stuck on a particular theory, because these theories, actor network theory, new materialism, post-humanism, object-oriented ontology, they're not really compatible, but they all sort of say the same thing. So the point of this paper was to say, free yourself from those shackles, just oscillate between them. Take a bit of this theory, make some decisions based on it, then take a bit of this theory, make some decisions based on it, allow yourself to bounce around. Still working on that space. Recently at the Aarhus Decennial Conference, we did a great workshop about that stuff. Did a track at the Design Research Society conference in 2024 that was really well subscribed and really interesting practice-based work. Then we'll be at the same conference next year, which is in Edinburgh. And this is the segue into some of the AI stuff. We created a couple of chatbots. So this was taking advantage of the newly available large language models and saying, can we use these to help people get their head around these weird more than human theories? Long story short, sort of yes, sort of no. They kind of, the chatbots are incredibly human-centered. So if you're trying, because they're based on human data, if you're trying to get them to operate outside of that, it's very hard, but there's more detail in the paper, but it's an ongoing thread of work. It's using large language models to enable more than human thinking. This was iconography, so trying to make AI legible and the route to explore it was by designing these little icons, and those are inspired by the icons you get inside your clothes. So they tell you the basics of how to look after these clothes. What would that look like for things that have got machine learning in there? That was the question here. There was a Chi paper about it. And again, it's another one where the process of designing the stuff, the design research part, that's where the insights are coming from. And that's the thread across all of these different bits of work. Along the way, our university started to freak out about generative AI. All the students were using it. So we wrote this paper that's, if you're interested in the impact on education of generative AI, there might be something useful in there. It's a kind of practical guide for instructors. It's a couple of years old now, but broadly, I think it still applies. And again, the knowledge in there came from practice. It came from doing things. The key thing that we did was actually take a bunch of our master's level assignments and set challenges for people saying, okay, here's ChatGPT or Gemini or whatever. See if you can make this essay. Here's the brief. You've got 10 minutes. And we saw what they could do on that level. Then what happens if you have half an hour and some references? And ultimately, we figured out that for our lecturers, which didn't know the content, but they are lecturers, you could make a first level master's essay with no knowledge in about half an hour quite easily. And with another 10 minutes, you could make it so it was very difficult to detect it was written by AI. Big takeaway is it's not to be scared of AI, it's that the assessments are out of date. We need to update the assessments so that you can't just get a chatbot to make a response. Okay, I'm going to skip through a bunch of stuff because there's very little time. This paper deals with people who say, all AI is plagiarism. Don't use it, it's bad for the environment. It's just a tool. It looks at these things, calls them semantic stop signs, and gives some strategies for working around those things. Not to say the issues are bad or wrong, but they stop the conversation, and we need to keep the conversation open. So that's a paper about that. This thing, the entoptic field camera, my Yesser, whose website this is, he came to work with me doing a postdoc, and this was his PhD work. Now, he came to do a completely different project that was teaching primary school kids an introduction to generative AI. And there Yesser is at the front of the class. We made this prototype that all the kids used, designed 6 weeks worth of curriculum. It was quite a shock for Yesser because he was a philosophy guy and wasn't anticipating becoming a primary school teacher. But what we were doing again is taking this design research way of looking at the world to the problem and seeing where we ended up. And where we ended up was super successful. Yeah, we wrote a paper about it that got a Best Paper Award, and it's become the basis for, this is a refactored version of what we made that we're building into a national scale platform. That's a bit of the prototype we're building at the moment. So we're hoping to turn this into what was a small scale prototype into something that's nationally available. But when Yesser showed up, his PhD work was this entoptic camera thing. And basically what the entoptic camera did was take a photograph, send it off to an AI, in this case StyleGAN, and then look at the results. And it's a really interesting way of exploring the material of AI. And here's Yesser presenting it at Mozilla Festival in Amsterdam. But I was always interested in what would happen if we give it a prompt, because StyleGAN didn't take a prompt. But while Yesser was working on that, Stable Diffusion came out, which you can prompt. And I really wanted to add in a prompt. And this was the first time we got together to play with that idea. And quite quickly, what we ended up doing was shining lights at the wall and using shadows as the input image. Now, the reason we did that is with just a raw input image of like you guys, it was totally crazy from image to image what was happening. Turning it into just shadows reduced the size of the latent space that was active inside the model and made the images much more predictable. This became an installation at the TEI conference. Here it is, and you can see there's the input image, and here's what the AI is producing. This was working at around 1 frame every 4 or 5 seconds. And it was a big success, and it was super interesting as a way of exploring the materiality of the AI. But you skip forward a few months, And here we are with the same thing, but running at 10 frames a second inside a shipping container at this event called EMF Camp, which is a great sort of hacker get together in a field. If you get a chance, you should go. And this really changed the type of interaction. Something I should say is with this first version, we had a single fixed text prompt behind it, which was this the name of an artist, which was Lottie Reiniger, and it was a comment on how the way the machine learning model works is by stealing, borrowing, using the style of this artist. We didn't mind using her name because she was long dead, but we used that style deliberately. And it's also why the piece is called shadow play. It's literally using shadows, but it's also referencing the shadows of the artist's work that's hidden inside the model. This one was operating so fast that we wanted to add in some extra prompts. So there's essentially a playlist of different prompts sitting in the background that get blended together randomly. So it adds a bit of variety, but if you spend a while there, you'll start to see that the same things repeat. Skip forward another few months, and we're here at the Light Up Lancaster Festival doing this for an audience of 100,000 people over a weekend. And we created this user interface that you see there that's called PromptJ. And this was taking inspiration from a DJ mixer. So there's channels, and each channel's got a list of text prompts on there. You can blend between them. This was allowing us for the first time to kind of perform with this. And we're learning all the time about how to interact with the prompts. Around the same time, we did this project. Again, there's a real-time image generator. This time, the prompts are dictated by the pieces of paper, and they are describing parts of musical instruments. So the task is design a new musical instrument by putting these prompts on the little white area. The higher they were, the stronger that prompt is in the model. The people we're working with all have dementia, and it's part of a bigger project exploring whether living a musical life can improve how it is to live with dementia. So this became part of our story at the same time. We're kind of learning about this user interface. We're learning about this interaction. And ultimately, what we came up with was this paper called From Prompt Engineering to Prompt Craft. The big takeaway from that is this idea of prompt craft. Making a good prompt is more like learning how to craft a piece of wood or use a particular kind of paint than it is an engineering discipline where there's a right way to do it, or there's a particular safe way to do it, or a particular guideline you can follow. There are general purpose insights you can get, but thinking of it as a craft-like activity seemed to be a useful framing for us. We continued at that point. We actually made a new user interface that I'll show you in a second called Prompt Tank. And this became a collaboration platform. So we worked with some bands. That's at a band at ThingsCon in the Netherlands. This is another band called Klanghouse. So you see the imagery in the background that's generated by our system. This is Windermere Science Festival. We did lots of these engagement events. This is again with people with dementia, using the same system, but to create portraits. So here it got a bit more complicated. We had people having a conversation. The conversation captured in audio, transcribed, run through a large language model, which produced prompts, which went into our system. We were then manipulating those prompts to create these images. And these all reflected some of the people in the room's experience of living with dementia. Here, they were talking about it's like being trapped on a roundabout. Here, they were talking, this was a very literal story of saying, to cope with this, I drink wine every day. These ones were more abstract, so it's like being caught in a web. I can never know quite where I'm going. So we used the system in that collaboration, which ultimately became an exhibition that you see some of there. This was another big festival we did, so an outdoor festival. And for the first time at this one, we gave people a huge stand where they could operate the system themselves. And the system they were using, it looks a bit like this. So to explain this user interface, beneath this line, these are text prompts you might give to the image model, but they're inactive because they're below the line. The ones above the line are active, and the higher they are, the more weight there is. Alongside, at the right-hand side, you've got an overall strength and some other parameters that control the model itself. And on the left-hand side, you've got things that control the input image. Now, how we came up with this design was based on what we called, it's the title of this paper, holistic prompt craft. And this is building on the same idea of think of this as a craft activity rather than an engineering activity. And the holistic part was a recognition that everything is related to everything. So each prompt, if it's active with another prompt, changes how the model navigates through its latent space. Everything about the input image, so the shape of it and the brightness of it, the contrast, the noisiness of it, every one of those parameters changes how the other parameters work. And every one of the parameters in the model, so the temperature or the strength, that changes all the other things. So what we called this holistic prompt craft, and there's no rule you can come up with, but it's a way of thinking about it. And based on that way of thinking, we went from this mixer-based model, this was the prompt J interface, to the prompt tank one that was more like this, which feels a lot more holistic. It's much more spatial and you can navigate it quite easily. Now, I'll stop talking because I've taken up nearly all the time and it'd be fun to have a bit more of a chat. Do have a couple more things I could easily say, but we'll see if they come up. One last thing I'll leave you with this is we've been dealing with this around real-time image generators, but you'll see if you go to the paper that we speculate on what would this mean if you applied the same interaction logic to large language models, for example, or multimodal models. So moving from the idea where you give one fixed prompt and wait for a response to something where you might be able to actually tweak individual parts of that prompt and in real time see the output. That will be possible with the coming generation of diffusion-based language models. And we think that this idea of prompt craft and holistic prompt craft is a useful metaphor to inform those design decisions. Looping back to the whole showing the world the value of design research stuff, this is the kind of insight that I don't think you can get to in any other way. You've got to make things and you've got to experience them firsthand to be able to get the kind of insights that allow you to come up with it's not a theory, it's what we refer to as a strong concept, which has some literature to explain what a strong concept is. It's something that should be useful and generative for other experts or designers or researchers. It doesn't have to be a proven theory. It's just something that should be useful if you're working in this space. So there's one example of the value of design research. Thank you for listening. And if you don't have any questions and you just want to leave because it's 4 o'clock, that's fine. But if you do, happy to chat.
Thank you so much for sharing your research with us today. It's amazing breadth and imagination, the work that you're doing. Any questions online or in the room?
Thanks so much. That was incredible playground of ideas. It's contagious enthusiasm and all that. With, I guess, design research, sometimes one of the questions is, okay, we're learning about the world to an extent as well. But I find that in HCI, one of the contexts is that the knowledge gets lost and it doesn't actually make it anywhere. I obviously see that there's a lot of examples where you've taken it to shows, events, and festivals and things like that. But specifically, I think you had one example where you said you'll develop into a nationwide system with the school. I can't remember exactly what the details were. I was kind of curious in terms of that being an example of design research, making it into real practice as opposed to this sort of, I don't want to distinguish it too much, but the more provocative practice of imagining and engaging people with the world and the fiction and things like that.
Yes. So my take on that is that the world of Kai, for example, there are people in there that are doing work with real impact that's changing the world beyond that kind of sphere. But the vast majority is the audiences, the people at the conference, the other academics, and it's not about changing the world. And that's fine. Academic research is great. And I don't think that's an issue reserved to design. I think it happens in all the other research methods as well. Arguably, I think that some design research, particularly the sort of pragmatic sort that's not there to provoke and be critical, but that sort that's really just trying to solve a contemporary problem, like the problem of interacting with real-time stable diffusion, or like the problem of how do you educate kids about this stuff, it's best placed to make impact on the world because as part of the method, you've got halfway to making the solution. I think that's arguably true of more engineering-focused ways into the problems as well. But I think it's really just partly a choice. Like, do you want to do purely academic work? And I point out in my PhD thesis, by the way, the word academic, one of the dictionary definitions is with no practical use, as in the phrase, oh, it's all academic. And there is a practical use, though, of course, in universities, it's to understand the world better. Another way of answering your question is super critical design that's some sort of totally out there weird prototype, and there is no explanation in the paper or the presentation saying why this is useful to anyone else. I don't love that stuff either, unless I just love it for its own sake. But it's one of the things I would be critical of as well. And strong concepts, this way of articulating this knowledge. The point of strong concepts is, or one of the requirements is, you need to be able to show to someone else why it's useful. And if you can't do that, I don't think it meets that criteria. And I think you're open to criticism for being hot there. I think we're out of time. There's some people want to get in. Thank you. Again. Sorry for taking up all the time. If you want to reach out or ask any other questions, just drop me an email.
Thank you, everyone.